There's a scene most of us carry somewhere in our heads. 3 ships, a wide blue ocean, a man in a plumed hat stepping onto a sandy beach, planting a flag, and gazing out at a new world. Maybe there's golden light. Maybe the natives are watching from the tree line. Maybe there's dramatic music playing in the background of your imagination. That scene isn't real, not the light, not the silence, not the simplicity of it. The actual moment Columbus made landfall in October of 1492 was messier, stranger, more uncertain, and in almost every sensory detail, completely different from the image that's been handed down through centuries of paintings and textbook illustrations. The beach smelled different. The sky looked different. The sounds were different. The coastline itself was almost certainly not the clean open shore your brain pictures. And the people standing on it were living inside a world so layered and complex that Columbus, even with his own eyes wide open, barely scratched the surface of what he was actually looking at. That's what this is about. Over the next little while, we're going to take apart the 1492 moment piece by piece. Not to tear down the history lesson, but to rebuild it with better details. Richer ones, the kind that actually make the past feel real instead of symbolic. We'll talk about what the ocean crossing was physically like, how Columbus navigated without GPS, without accurate maps, and without a reliable sense of how far he'd actually travelled. We'll talk about the ecosystems he would have encountered, the reefs and mangroves and forest sounds that don't make it into any painting. We'll talk about the Taíno people who were already there, not as a footnote, but as a civilization with their own politics, their own trade routes, their own way of reading the arrival of 3 wooden ships on the horizon. And we'll talk about the journals. What Columbus actually wrote down, what got edited, what got lost, and how much of what we think we know about that October morning is reconstruction rather than eyewitness fact. The point isn't to replace one clean story with another clean story. It's to sit with something more honest. History is almost always more interesting when you get close enough to feel the salt spray and the confusion and the sheer strangeness of being a human being in a moment that neither you nor anyone else fully understands while it's happening. If you're using this to fall asleep tonight, that's genuinely what I make these for. So settle in. And if you're still awake enough to leave a comment, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is. It's something I actually check, and every time I do, it's a little disorienting in the best way. Someone in Auckland in the middle of their morning, someone in London before their commute, someone in Texas at 2 a.m. who absolutely should be asleep. All of you, at completely different points in your day, sharing the same history. There's something fitting about that given what we're about to explore. Because 1492 isn't just a date, it's a collision point. A moment where 2 halves of the human world, which had been developing entirely separately for somewhere around 15,000 years, suddenly became aware of each other again. And everything about that collision, the fear, the misreading, the wonder, the catastrophic misunderstanding of intentions and languages and values, everything was shaped by context. The world Columbus left behind in Europe, the world that already existed on those islands, the ocean between them which was not an empty gap but a living system with its own logic, its own moods, its own rules. To understand what Columbus actually saw in 1492, you have to understand where he came from, what he was expecting, and how radically what he found failed to match any of it. Let's start there. Columbus left from a continent on edge. The Iberian Peninsula in the late 15th century was not a place of settled confidence. It was a place of enormous pressure, enormous ambition, and enormous fear, and all 3 of those things got onto the ships with him. Portugal had been pushing south and east along the African coast for decades, chipping away at the edges of the known world one headland at a time. Spain, which wasn't really Spain yet in the modern sense, but a freshly merged collection of kingdoms under Ferdinand and Isabella, was watching that Portuguese progress with something between admiration and dread. Trade routes mattered the way internet infrastructure matters today. Whoever controlled them controlled wealth, and whoever controlled wealth controlled everything else. The overland routes to Asia, to spices and silk, and the goods that made European merchants rich, had been getting harder. The Ottoman Empire sat across the eastern Mediterranean and wasn't particularly interested in making things easy for Christian traders. So the search for an ocean route, either east around Africa or west across the Atlantic, wasn't an adventure story. It was a strategic emergency. Then there was the religious dimension, and you can't understand Columbus without it. 1492 was the same year the Spanish crown completed the Reconquista, driving the last Muslim rulers out of Granada and expelling the Jewish population from Spain in the same stroke. The atmosphere was intensely, almost ferociously Catholic. The monarchy needed money to fund crusades and to consolidate power. Columbus genuinely believed, and said so in his journals, that the wealth from a western route to Asia could fund a new crusade to recapture Jerusalem. He wasn't just a sailor looking for trade, he was operating inside a world view where geography and theology were completely intertwined, where new lands were first and foremost souls to be converted, and where personal ambition and divine mission felt like the same thing. Isabella and Ferdinand were not funding a voyage of pure curiosity. They were making a calculated bet on a man who had pitched his idea to Portugal first and been turned down, and who had spent years lobbying for financial backing. The terms Columbus negotiated, and he negotiated hard, included titles, a percentage of any wealth discovered, and governorship of any lands he found. He was not a humble explorer grateful for a chance. He was an ambitious operator who understood that if he succeeded, he wanted the receipts to prove it. Now, what did he actually think was out there? This is where popular history gets fuzzy and interesting. There's a persistent myth that Europeans in 1492 thought the world was flat, and Columbus was bravely sailing toward the edge. That is almost entirely wrong. Educated Europeans had known the Earth was spherical since ancient Greece. The real debate wasn't about shape, it was about size. Specifically, how wide was the ocean between Europe and Asia? Columbus thought it was much, much narrower than it actually is. He had read Marco Polo. He had read the classical geographers. And he had, in what we might charitably call motivated reasoning, chosen the estimates that supported his project. He calculated the circumference of the Earth too small and the length of Asia too large, which conveniently made the Western Ocean seem crossable. Most educated contemporaries who rejected his pitch weren't saying the Earth was flat. They were saying correctly that he had his math wrong, and the ocean was far wider than he claimed. Columbus was not a visionary fighting superstition. He was a man who got lucky that a continent he didn't know existed happened to be sitting in the gap between him and his incorrect destination. He crossed the Atlantic expecting Asia. He was looking for the outlying islands described in Marco Polo's accounts, places like Cipangu, which was Japan. He was listening for languages that might echo anything from the trading ports of the Indian Ocean. He was watching for spices, for signs of the sophisticated merchant civilizations he'd read about. That expectation is not a footnote. It is the central fact about what he actually saw when he arrived, because what you expect to see shapes what you report seeing, sometimes to an almost astonishing degree. The practical experience Columbus brought with him was real, though. He wasn't sailing into total darkness. European sailors had been pushing into the Atlantic for decades by the time the Santa Maria left port. The Portuguese had colonized Madeira and the Azores in the mid-Atlantic. They had settled the Canary Islands, which Columbus used as his final departure point, and which were already understood as a kind of Atlantic staging ground. The Portuguese had established trading routes along the entire West African coast, reaching the Gulf of Guinea and beyond. Sailors on those routes had learned something genuinely important about the Atlantic, that its winds and currents had patterns, that you couldn't just sail in a straight line and expect to come back, that the ocean had moods and logic that rewarded patience and observation. Columbus knew from those West African routes that the trade winds blew steadily from the northeast at certain latitudes. He used exactly that knowledge to pick his route, sailing south to the Canaries first, and then turning west on the trade wind belt. He also knew from the experience of pilots on the West African runs that you often had to sail a great curve to come home, pushing north to find the westerlies that would carry you back to Europe. The return route wasn't improvised. It was built on accumulated Atlantic knowledge that had been quietly developing for generations before 1492. And there were the stories, the rumours, the pieces of driftwood and carved objects that had occasionally washed up on Atlantic shores. Sailors in the Azores and Canaries had found unfamiliar wood and plant material drifting in from the west. There were persistent tales of islands out there somewhere. Some of these stories were mythology. Some of them may have been garbled accounts of real objects that had drifted across from the Americas on the same currents Columbus would use. The point is that the Atlantic was not purely unknown. It was a space that was partially mapped in imagination, if not on paper, filled in with assumptions and hopes and fears. Columbus carried all of that into the ocean with him. The theology, the debt to his investors, the determination to make his numbers work, the hybrid of real navigational experience and optimistic misreading of the classical sources. He wasn't sailing as a blank observer. Nobody does. He was sailing as a very specific kind of 15th century Iberian man, with a head full of Marco Polo and Crusader ambitions and the pressing need to prove that the Portuguese hadn't beaten him to something world-changing. That's the man who would eventually look up from the deck of the Santa Maria and see land for the first time in 33 days. Not a clean observer, a loaded one, and that loading, those expectations and motives and prior experiences shaped every sentence he wrote about what he found. To understand what he actually saw, you first have to understand what he was certain he was going to see. Which means before we talk about the coastline, we have to talk about how he got there. When you step onto the deck with Columbus in 1492, you're not stepping into an age of GPS-level precision, suddenly turned off. You're stepping into a world that had never known precise longitude at all, that measured position on the surface of the Earth, with tools that were half geometry, half habit, and half faith. Latitude, north-south position, was the thing they were most confident about. Sailors in the Atlantic world had a steadily improving toolkit for that. They could measure the height of the pole star above the horizon at night with a simple instrument like a mariner's astrolabe or a wooden cross staff, and compare that angle to tables in their sea manuals. If Polaris was, say, 28 degrees above the horizon, you knew you were roughly at 28 degrees north. It wasn't exact in a modern sense, but it was repeatable. You could follow a line of latitude across the ocean the way you might follow a lane on a dark highway by keeping your headlights fixed on the painted divider. But east-west position, longitude, was a different creature entirely. To know how far east or west you'd sailed, you needed accurate time. You needed to know what time it was back at your reference meridian, and what time it was on your ship, and compare the two. 15th century Europe simply couldn't do that at sea. Clocks that worked on land didn't keep reliable time on a heaving, damp, temperature-changing wooden vessel. Pendulums swung differently. Springs expanded and contracted. Everything slipped. So instead of true longitude, they used something more fragile. Dead reckoning. Dead reckoning sounds simple, and in outline it is. You start from a known point, say, the Canary Islands. You estimate your speed with a log line, a rope with knots tied at known intervals, and a chip of wood at the end. You throw the chip into the water, let it trail behind the ship, and count how many knots pay out in a fixed time. That gives you speed in knots. You pair that with the direction of travel from your compass. Adjust in your head or on a slate for the push of currents and the set of the wind as best you can. And then, day after day, you add up the imagined track. Your ship's position becomes a moving sum of guesses. Some of those guesses could be very good. Experienced pilots knew when their helmsman tended to steer a little high or low on the wind. They felt the difference between a following current and a head current in the way the ship moved. They were constantly correcting their own mental map. But you can feel the problem building. Every tiny misjudgment feeds into tomorrow's starting point. When you're a week or two out, the error bars begin to swell. When you're 33 days from land, your plotted spot on the blank ocean is less a point than a cloud. This is the navigational world Columbus lived in, and it's the world that made his calculations controversial before he ever left port. Because Columbus, unlike many of his critics, wasn't just using dead reckoning between known coasts. He was using it to bridge what he thought was the entire gap between Europe and Asia. And to make that gap manageable, he had quietly rewritten the scale of the Earth. He took the smallest plausible values for the Earth's circumference. He took the largest plausible estimates for the width of Asia. He measured degrees of latitude not in the more accurate Arabic miles, but in shorter Roman or Italian miles, compressing the globe in his head. Put all of that together, and in his ledger, the Western Ocean shrank. The distance from the Canary Islands to what he called the Indies became something a late medieval ship could plausibly attempt. Plenty of educated people around him noticed what he'd done. Portuguese cosmographers who had been crawling down the coast of Africa with careful incremental measurements looked at his numbers and saw wishful thinking. Court scholars in Spain raised objections. Their argument was not mystical fear of sea monsters. It was basically, the Earth is too big, the ocean is too wide, and your provisions will run out long before you reach Japan. Columbus's genius, if you like, was not that he had better data. It was that he insisted on the optimistic set of numbers and refused to let go. Once he was at sea, that insistence didn't stop. It shaped the way he handled distance in his day-to-day record-keeping. On the first voyage, he kept 2 distances in his log. One was the real estimate of how far they'd sailed west each day. The other was a shorter figure, he told the crew. Part of this was morale management. The farther west you went, the longer the return trip would be if you had to turn back. Men who thought they had sailed a little less might be a little less likely to panic. But part of it was also Columbus managing the narrative he would bring back. The shorter the distance to landfall on paper, the easier it would be to claim he had been right all along about the narrowness of the ocean. Now, imagine living inside that system, night after night, when there is nothing on any horizon, and the math is, at best, approximate. Your world becomes a set of layered uncertainties. You know your latitude pretty well, you know in a rough way how much westing you've made. But you don't know how far away land actually is because the total width of the ocean is wrong in your head. You don't know how much quiet drift the currents have added when everyone was asleep. You don't know whether that faint line of cloud at dawn is just weather or the subtle signature of a far-off island. Under those conditions, landfall isn't a clean moment of discovery. It's a process of testing, doubting, and reinterpreting everything you think you see. You start with signs, a branch floating by that seems freshly cut, a clump of seaweed that looks like the coastal sargassum near known shores, a bird you think is land-based, flying at a particular angle at sunset. Each hint knocks against your dead reckoning in your mind. If I am where I think I am, and if Asia is where I have placed it, then surely these birds mean land within a day or 2 or 3. Voyagers before Columbus had chased these signs and been wrong. Mist banks looked like cliffs and melted. The ocean plays tricks with light and perspective. Every false sighting nibbles at trust, not just in the senses but in the numbers. When land finally does appear, when a watchman shouts in the pre-dawn darkness, it answers some questions and raises others. Are you as far west as you think? Is this the island you had expected at this latitude? Have the last 30 days of logged distances been broadly correct? Or has some unseen current slid you north or south of your imagined track? Once again, the only tools you have to answer those questions are the very logbooks and mental maps whose accuracy is in doubt. Those logbooks matter for another reason. They're not just private journals. They're evidence for sponsors, tools for future pilots, and in Columbus's case, the foundation of his claim that he had reached the fringes of Asia. What gets written down is already selective. You copy over the daily notes into a cleaner version. You smooth out contradictions. You might downplay the extent of your course changes, the moments when you circle back to recheck something. You might amplify the signs that support your preferred interpretation. The certain-sounding note that the people resemble those of the Indies, the confident identification of a spice that might not actually be what you think. And after the voyage, those texts can be edited again. Summaries prepared by others, translations that reshape the tone, politically convenient omissions. We do not have Columbus's original ship's log from the first voyage. We have later versions and narratives derived from it, filtered through the needs of a returning hero, a suspicious court, and, eventually, a colonial administration that wanted clear, usable claims. All of this folds back into the core problem of distance. When Columbus says he sailed a certain number of leagues from point A to point B, when he says an island lies so many miles from another, he is speaking from within that fog of estimation, correction, and later rewriting. The precision is more apparent than real. So when we ask, what did he see on that first landfall? We are asking a question that sits on top of layers of navigational uncertainty. The coastline he describes is framed by a guess at where he is on the planet. The islands he strings together on his chart are spaced out according to dead reckoning distances that may or may not line up with reality. Even the sequence of sights and sounds and encounters is shaped by logs that could be, and probably were, adjusted after the fact to make a smoother story. The navigation of 1492 didn't just carry him to land. It shaped the very coordinates of his perception. It set the stage for every later argument about which island he reached, how far he'd actually gone, and whether his descriptions match one particular shoreline or another. Before we walk up onto that beach with him, we have to keep that in mind. His eyes are reporting one thing, his instruments another, his expectations a third, and his logbook polished for posterity, something else again. Columbus could only live inside that fog of numbers because the ocean itself gave him a kind of invisible road to follow. In the late 15th century, Atlantic sailors already knew there was a pattern to the winds and currents, even if they couldn't yet explain it in global terms. If you sailed south and west from Europe, out past the Canary Islands, the wind would, more often than not, settle into a steady push from behind your right shoulder. These were the trade winds, the northeast trades of the North Atlantic, flowing from the northeast toward the southwest, bending gently toward the equator. You didn't have to understand Hadley cells or pressure belts to feel their logic. The sails filled and stayed filled, the waves lined up, all running the same way. The ship's rigging leaned into a consistent strain, instead of twitching and snapping with every gust. To a pilot like Columbus, this was as close to a promise as the Atlantic ever made. Set your course, hold the wind on this quarter, and it will carry you west. Beneath the hull, another system was working in his favour. The surface currents of the Atlantic run roughly in a clockwise gyre. Down near the latitude of the Canaries, the north equatorial current slides west, driven by those same trades. To men topside, it was mostly invisible. You couldn't see the current itself, but you could feel it in the way the wake streamed, in the slightly easier movement when the sea was helping, rather than holding you back. For Columbus, who had narrowed the ocean in his calculations, that hidden push would have felt like confirmation. The days of good runs added up fast. 30 leagues, 33, sometimes 40. The logline numbers lined up with the feeling of speed. The whole physical world seemed to be cooperating with the story in his head. The world is smaller, Asia is closer, the westward way is the natural one. Inside that apparently benevolent system, though, life on the ships was anything but gentle. A wooden caravel or naw is not a quiet place. The hull never stops talking. Timbers flex with every wave. Joints complain as the planking works against the caulking. There is a constant background of creaks and groans, like an old house in a windstorm that never ends. Each change in the sea's rhythm has its own sound, a slap under the bow, a hollow boom when a larger wave hits just right, a new whistle in the rigging as a fresh breeze pushes through a different angle. Salt is everywhere. Spray dries on every exposed surface, leaving a crust that gets into ropes, clothes, hair, food, skin cracks, lips split, the soft furnishings of life, blankets, shirts, even the wood itself, stiffen and rasp. When the sea is running high, the forward parts of the ship are often soaked. Men sleep damp, wake damp, work damp. Heat builds under these conditions in ways that are hard to imagine from the safety of a modern room. As they moved farther south and west, away from the temperate breezes of Iberia, and into subtropical and tropical belts, the air thickened. Below decks, where casks of water, wine, and provisions were stored, air barely moved at all. The smell was a layered thing: tar, wet wood, salt, animal fat from preserved meat, mould unwashed bodies, latrines, and the slow sweet sour of food beginning to go off. Rations themselves carried their own sensory message. Biscuit that had been baked hard enough to last months collected weevils and larvae in its interior. You learned to dunk it in liquid, not just to soften it, but to float out the living parts. Salt meat, over time, broke down into stringy, fibrous chunks, sometimes tinged with green around the edges. Barrels of water picked up the flavour of the wood and whatever else had gotten into them. The men drank it anyway, day after day. On deck, during good weather, the world could almost seem empty. Horizon in every direction, a clean hard line between sea and sky. But even that simplicity was deceptive. Visibility over the ocean is constantly shifting. Morning can bring a low haze, a pale band at the rim of the world, where the brightness of the rising sun strikes the moist air. That band can look to a tired eye like a far-off shore. Under certain conditions, a bank of clouds that sits, hour after hour, in roughly the same spot can be read as land, especially by men primed to expect it. Clouds that build over warm water sometimes stack up in ways that mimic the silhouette of distant hills. Light plays along their bottom edges, giving the illusion of a coastline. Squalls complicate things further. In the trades, you can go from clear blue sky to a sudden darkening in one quadrant, a smear of charcoal grey where a small storm is pulling itself together. The squall line can look solid from afar, like a bar of land rising out of the sea. As it approaches, the wind veers, the temperature drops, rain comes in hard. Visibility collapses into a tight circle of white water and noise. Then, half an hour later, maybe less, it's gone. The horizon opens again, and whatever you thought you saw beneath or beyond that darkness dissolves. Clouds can also hide real land. Islands generate their own local weather. Warm, forested slopes throw moisture back into the air. In some conditions, that means a persistent cap of clouds sitting over a place you can't yet see. If you're watching from the deck of a rolling ship, that cap might be all you notice at first, just another bank in a sky full of banks. The actual line of shoreline could remain below the curve of the earth or lost in the glare and haze until you are much closer than you expect. At night, the entire sensory map changes. The open ocean under a moonless sky is one of the deepest darknesses humans regularly experienced in the 15th century. Away from land fires, away from any other ships, there is nothing to dilute it. The sea turns from a textured blue-green to a vast black surface, broken only by the foam at the bow and the faint silver of starlight. Those stars, though, were an anchor. Sailors didn't just use the pole star for latitude. They lived under patterns, the familiar shapes that rose and set at predictable times of year, the way a particular constellation would hang at a certain height when you were on a known parallel. Even if you couldn't read them with the precision of an astronomer, you could feel when the sky looked right and when it didn't. On the long westward leg, the nightly procession of stars told the crew in a quiet way that the world was still behaving itself. Sometimes the sea itself glowed. Bioluminescent plankton, disturbed by the ship's passage, could turn the wake into a trail of cold fire. Breaking waves flashed, the bow wave flickered around the hull, to a mind already steeped in signs and omens that living light could mean many things: good fortune, supernatural presence, just something strange and beautiful, out beyond explanation. For a tired lookout standing in the dark, it was also a practical reminder that the water was moving, that time was passing, that he was not alone on an invisible plain. Darkness changed sound too, without the distraction of sights. The creaks and groans and flapping canvas became sharper. A faint change in the noise of the waves could make a watchman's heart jump. Was that surf on a hidden reef, or just a bigger swell slapping the hull? A smell of damp earth or vegetation on the wind, the kind of thing you might convince yourself you noticed after weeks of open sea air, could send minds racing. There must be land to windward, there has to be. Emotionally, nights stretched. The gap between what you could know and what you could imagine widened. Men on these voyages were not blank measuring instruments. They were people carrying expectations, fears, vows. Every hint was amplified by the dark. A darker line on the horizon at dawn, a slightly different turbulence in the water. The sudden clustering of birds at sunset, each became a candidate for land. This is how the physical ocean feeds directly into dispute. When a lookout cries land in the small hours, what exactly has he seen? A star rising or setting behind a cloud bank can look, for a moment, like a point of light on shore. A distant squall's edge, barely darker than the sky around it, can be mistaken for a low coastline. Another crewman, glancing up a heartbeat later from a different angle, may see nothing at all. One claims the honour of the first sighting, another insists there was no land in view. The master, peering from the quarterdeck, has to decide which perception to trust. Later, when logs are written up and stories retold, those fleeting impressions harden into statements. At 2 hours after midnight, land was first seen. But under that neat line lies a night full of half-glimpses, shifting cloud, and the nervous energy of men who know the provisions are finite and the numbers in their captain's head may or may not be right. So when we come to the question of where Columbus actually made landfall, we're dealing not just with geography and charts, but with all of this. The push of unseen currents, the tricks of haze and cloud, the pressure of long nights at sea. The ocean itself doesn't just carry ships, it bends their paths, manipulates their senses, and quietly shapes the very moments that later become first sight of land in the record. When dawn finally brought a coastline that did not dissolve, it solved one problem and created another. Columbus himself believed the first land they reached in October 1492 was part of Asia, one of the outer islands off Cipangu, Japan, described in Marco Polo. That belief shaped every word he wrote about it. But when you strip away the imagined Asia and just look at what he actually describes, low island, very flat, ringed with reefs, multiple nearby islets, clear water, sandy bottom, you're left with something that could match more than one place in the Bahamas. That's where the argument starts, and why it hasn't really ended. We're talking about a region that, from the deck of a 15th century ship, looks more like a single sprawling watery maze than a neat collection of separate islands. Shallow banks stretch for miles, changing the colour of the sea from deep blue to turquoise, to pale green long before you see land. Coral heads rise out of nowhere. Tiny cays, some no bigger than fields, sit on the edges of submerged plateaus. Mangrove fringes blur the line between sea and shore. To an approaching crew, it's all one shimmering, layered presence. Columbus called his first landfall San Salvador. There is today an island in the Bahamas that bears that name. For a long time, many historians accepted it as the same place. But names move, maps get redrawn. And when scholars in the 19th and 20th centuries began matching his daily courses, estimated distances and descriptions against modern charts, doubts multiplied. The evidence they use is a strange patchwork. At its core is Columbus's journal, preserved only in a later summary and paraphrase made by Bartolomé de las Casas, that already introduces uncertainty. Some distances rounded, some phrases compressed, some bearings simplified. We don't have an exact log. We have a remembered and edited one. From that text, researchers pull out every hint they can. The direction of the wind on the night of first sighting. The number of leagues sailed each day in the approach. The time between first cry of land and anchoring. The statement that the island was very flat and with very green trees, and that there was a lagoon, and that there were other islets nearby, very many in number. Then they overlay this with what we know now about the region's winds and currents in October. The trades still blow from the northeast. The north equatorial current still slides west. Local set and drift around the Bahama banks create their own complications, eddies and countercurrents that can nudge a ship sideways over hours and days. Modern navigators can model these forces, but Columbus could only feel them indirectly in the way the ship responded. Add to this the sequence of islands he says he visited right after the first one. From the land he named San Salvador, he describes sailing to another larger island he calls Santa Maria de la Concepcion, then to Fernandina, then to Isabella, noting bends in the shoreline, harbours, channels, sounds between islands, and the presence or absence of large villages. Each of these snapshots has to line up, like pieces in a sliding puzzle, for any proposed route to make sense. Different scholars slide the pieces into different patterns. One camp lines up the clues with the modern island of San Salvador, formerly Watling's Island. It has a large inland lake that could match his mention of a lagoon. Its orientation and nearby cays can be made, with a bit of interpretive flex, to fit his sailing directions in the days after landfall. Another camp argues for Samana Cay, farther to the southeast. Its shoreline and the configuration of adjacent reefs and cays seem, to them, a better match for his descriptions of sailing along the coast and anchoring off islets. The distances he gives from island to island, when converted from leagues to nautical miles, fall more neatly into place on some reconstructions that use Samana as the starting point. Others propose Grand Turk, or Planner Cays, or the Ragged Islands, each backed by careful rereadings of the text and modern sailings meant to test how a late medieval ship would actually move under those winds. No proposal can satisfy every line of the journal without strain. Some ignore certain bearings, others downplay inconvenient remarks about harbours or distances. The islands themselves have changed too. Shorelines erode, channels silt up, reefs grow. A lagoon that was open to the sea in 1492 might be more enclosed now, or vice versa. Underneath all of this lies the physical complexity of the Bahamian environment itself. From a distance, you might think you're approaching a solid line of land. As you get closer, what looked like a simple coast breaks into an outer reef, then a line of low cays, then an inner bank with deeper channels. The sound of surf reaches you before the land does. The colour of the water starts warning you, deep indigo giving way to luminous blue, then milky green over sand. A lead line might show 5 fathoms, then 4, then 3, without any visible shoreline close at hand. For a pilot used to the steeper drop-offs of European coasts, this was a different kind of problem. Anchoring required enough depth for the ship's draft, but not so much that you couldn't get purchase on the bottom. In these waters, you could find yourself in 10 fathoms one moment, then drifting toward coral heads that rose nearly to the surface the next. The safest place for the hull might be farther out, behind an unseen break in the reef, rather than tucked in close to a beach. Cays complicate the mental picture of an island. A single limestone lump topped with scrub and a ring of sand counts as an island in the journal, just as much as a larger forested mass with inland ponds and villages. Columbus remarks on many small islets nearby. But what counts as many? 5, 20, a whole ragged chain? 2 observers on different decks or at different moments might offer different counts, especially in the shifting light of dawn or dusk. Reefs themselves are not all alike. Some break the surface, others lurk a few feet below, betrayed only by the pattern of breaking wave crests or the peculiar stillness of water over them in calm weather. In clear Bahamian light, you can, from aloft, read the bottom like a map. From the deck of a rocking lateen-rigged caravel in a slight haze, you might not. A lookout's shouted "breaker ahead" could correspond to a feature that leaves no trace in modern satellite images, because it has since grown, eroded, or been recharted under a different name. All of this makes retronavigation a delicate exercise. Each proposed landfall is a best fit, not a solved equation. Why does the exact where matter at all, beyond cartographic neatness? Because each candidate island would have greeted the Spaniards with a slightly different world. The density and layout of Taíno communities varied from island to island, even within the Bahamas. Some had larger, more centralized villages, others were more thinly settled. Freshwater availability differed, so did soil quality, types of shoreline, immediate access to certain foods like particular fish, conch, or fruits. If Columbus first stepped ashore on an island with only small hamlets and brackish ponds, his earliest impressions of these people and this land would tilt one way. If instead he landed where there was a substantial settlement, well-cleared fields and obvious canoe traffic, the tone of his reports, the sense of abundance or scarcity, power or vulnerability shifts. Those first descriptions travelled back to Europe and anchored later narratives. The idea of the Indians as generous, timid, naked, easy to conquer or convert all comes filtered through a very specific initial encounter on a particular beach, with a particular group of people under particular conditions of tide, anchorage and mutual surprise. Change the island and you may change the faces in that story. Their dialect, their ornaments, the way they gesture at the sky or the sea, the direction they point when asked by signs and guesses where gold might be found. Even resource notes depend on place. Some candidate islands lie closer to richer fishing grounds, others nearer trade routes that linked the Bahamas to larger Taíno centres in Cuba or Hispaniola. If the first landfall was further southeast, the path Columbus chose afterward looks different. Which islands came next? Which coasts felt promising? Where he thought he saw signs of the mainland? So historians keep worrying this question, not just to plant a flag on the right sandbar, but to fine-tune everything that follows. The location of that first anchor drop ripples outward into our understanding of first contact, of how quickly news of the strangers spread through indigenous networks, of why certain later settlements were attempted where they were. In the end, the debate itself is a reminder that the scene you carry in your head, Columbus's ships gliding toward a single iconic island, is a simplification laid over a far messier reality. A ship entering a tangled field of reefs and cays, men peering through heat haze and morning glare, trying to decide in real time which patch of green and sand was solid enough to name. From that uncertain beginning, everything else unfolded. From that tangled field of reefs and cays, the coastline doesn't arrive as a clean line. It emerges in layers. First you get colours, Out beyond the banks, the water is a deep, almost oily blue. Then, as the soundings creep upward, it shifts to an impossible turquoise, the kind you might assume is exaggerated in photographs, except here it's real. Under the hull, sandbars and shoals throw back light. The sea turns pale green over white sand, darker patches where turtle grass or coral heads interrupt the bottom. Long before you can make out trees or a definite beach, you're sailing over a living, moving chart painted in colour alone. Then the sound reaches you, a low, constant roar that doesn't quite match the visible sea. That's the outer reef line, sometimes miles from any dry land. Waves that have rolled for thousands of miles across the Atlantic suddenly meet a rough limestone rampart and break. To Columbus's pilots, that noise is both a promise and a warning. Land must be near, but there is something solid and shallow between you and it. When land finally draws itself out of the haze, it may not look like the classic crescent of sand you might imagine. Instead, you see dark green bands at water level mangroves sitting in the shallows, their roots propped on stilts, their trunks not rising from firm ground but from water itself. Behind them, a slightly higher line of paler green marks dry forest. Somewhere, small interruptions of white hint at openings where a beach actually touches open sea. To a European mariner trained in the Atlantic and Mediterranean, a good harbour is a bite taken out of a solid coast, with deep water right up close. A bay with a river mouth or a sheltered cove with rocky headlands. In the Bahamas and the Greater Antilles, the geometry is often reversed. You have an almost continuous fringing reef offshore, then a lagoon of relatively quiet shallow water, then a fuzzy green edge of mangroves. The real land doesn't begin at the visible shore, it's set back, hidden behind this amphibious band. Mangroves confuse expectations. They look like land at a distance, but up close they're more like floating thickets. Their tangle of roots traps sediment and builds soil slowly, creating new ground over centuries. In 1492, many of these zones would have been even more extensive than they are today. To a pilot in a deep draught vessel, they can make everywhere look like almost harbour, and nowhere feel truly safe. Between reef and mangrove, water does strange things with depth. A glassy lagoon might be 12 feet deep in one spot, and just 3 in the next, with no clear visual cue, until the bottom suddenly gleams brighter closer. For Columbus and his crews, this meant a constant choreography of caution, boats ahead, leadsmen in the chains, voices calling out the depth in sing-song rhythm, 4 fathoms, 3.5, 3. Nightfall complicates everything. In open ocean, you can heave to and drift off a reef-bound coast. You don't want to wake up on the wrong side of an uncharted coral head. Anchoring requires judgment. Drop too far out, and the anchor may not bite well. Too far in and the ship might swing, with a wind shift or tide, into shallows that weren't under you when you arrived. Reefs themselves are treacherously deceptive. Some form a solid, nearly continuous barrier. Others break, gap, and reappear. An inviting stretch of calm water inside the breakers might have only a single narrow, twisting entrance. Without local knowledge, what looks like a useful passage might be a false entrance, an apparent opening that shoals to nothing, or that leads you into a cul-de-sac of shallows with no room to turn a square-rigged ship around. This is where small boats matter. Columbus repeatedly sends the ship's boat sounding ahead, probing for a channel through the reef. The men in that boat are the scouts, feeling their way along until they find a cut where the depth holds. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they come back with a simple verdict, too dangerous to attempt. The ship then has to stand off, maybe anchor in open roadstead, crews getting to land by the same small boat, or not getting there at all. From the deck, a coastline like this can look oddly empty. No stone quays, no harbour towns huddled at river mouths. No towers or church steeples, just a low line of trees and scrub, punctuated by white sand. Columbus remarks again and again on how very green and very beautiful the islands are, but there's an implied rest of the sentence, and strangely lacking the kind of built waterfront he expected for lands of the Great Khan. But that visual emptiness is misleading. Taino villages were rarely built right on the open beach. They sat back a little on slightly higher, better drained ground, near freshwater sources. Paths ran from canoe landings through the mangroves or along shaded trails to plazas and houses inland. From half a mile offshore, at certain angles, you might not see any of this at all, just canopy. Canoes themselves could vanish into that edge. A dugout pulled up into mangrove shade, its hull dark and wet, disappears against the roots. A narrow creek that serves as a busy water highway inland looks, from a moving ship, like a wrinkle in the green. Even smoke can trick the eye. In humid tropical air, low cooking fires diffuse into the general haze. Only larger ritual or signal fires rise as distinct plumes, and those not always at the shoreline. So a European observer might scan this coast and note only few houses or no town, even when a network of hamlets, gardens and meeting spaces lay just beyond view. A bay that seems unclaimed might, in local terms, belong clearly to a particular cacique, its fishing grounds, and canoe routes mapped by generations of use. Governance hides in this landscape just as effectively as villages do. Political centres in Taíno societies were measured less by stone walls and more by the reach of kin ties, tribute flows, ceremonial ball courts. None of that is obvious from the sea. A modest-looking landing place could be the maritime front door of an important chiefdom. A quiet stretch of shore could be the edge of a politically marginal area, or a boundary between spheres of influence. Columbus has to guess. He reads coastline density, how many houses he can see, how many canoes come out as a proxy for population, power, and potential wealth. But the coast is playing tricks on him. Reefs push his ships to anchor where the bottom cooperates, not necessarily opposite the busiest places. Mangroves curtain the approaches. Sandbars redirect where boats can safely cross. The result is a series of impressions built from partial views. A small island with few people might, a day's paddle away, connect to a heavily populated archipelago of settlements the Spaniards never see. A good harbour in his journal might be excellent for caravels, yet unimportant in Taíno trade routes, which favour different channels and landings. The shoreline itself becomes an unreliable narrator. It offers hints, a cleared patch here, a canoe wake there, but it does not translate its own story into terms familiar to an admiral expecting Asian ports. As the ships circle, anchor and edge along these reefs and mangroves, Columbus is not just charting geography. He is unknowingly misreading a social map drawn in paths, gardens and quiet inlets just out of sight. Step past that mangrove curtain in your mind, wading onto firmer ground, and the island starts to sort itself into bands. Just behind the tangle of roots and brackish creeks, the first truly dry land rises only a few feet. But in this landscape, a few feet is everything. Here, on slightly higher, salt-kissed soil, you get coastal scrub. Low, tough shrubs. Thickets of sea grape with their round, leathery leaves and dangling clusters of fruit. Spiny bushes that don't look like much until you walk through them and realise they are perfectly adapted to glare, wind, and occasional salt spray. To a sailor used to European shores, this edge would feel both familiar and strange. Familiar, because there is always some zone of hardy plants along a coast. Strange, because nothing here fits the categories in his head. No familiar gorse, no Mediterranean olives, no heather. The greens are glossier, the leaves broader, the air thicker with resin and plant scent. The very shape of the shrubs, twisted by wind, crowded evergreen whispers that winter, as he knows it, never truly comes. Where the soil deepens and salt influence eases, palms begin to appear. Not the decorative palms of a postcard, but a whole architecture of tall, column-straight trunks and feathered crowns. Coconut palms would have been present in some places by 1492, but there were also native palms, royal palm that can reach impressive heights, cabbage palms with edible hearts, stands of palmetto. For European eyes, used to associating fruit with orchards and shade trees with temperate forests, the idea that food just hangs overhead in tough green husks, ready to be hacked down, is quietly astonishing. Columbus notes again and again on his first voyage the abundance of many kinds of trees and fruits, often without names. Part of that is botanical ignorance. Part of it is the genuine surprise of an ecosystem where productivity seems less carefully staged. No neat rows, no hedgerows, no vineyard trellises, just layered vegetation that produces wood, fibre, fruit and shelter without the visible geometry of fields. Move still further inland, and the low scrub and open palm groves begin to give way to hardwood forests, especially on the larger islands. Here the canopy closes overhead, mahogany, cedrela, lignum vitae, and dozens of other hardwoods knit into a mid-elevation cloak. Vines loop from branch to branch. Epiphytes root in bark instead of earth. Light becomes a filtered thing, patterned in green and gold. To a crewman walking up from a beach landing, the shift in sound is as dramatic as the shift in colour. Out on the reef you had surf and wind. In among the trees there is the constant insect chorus, the occasional crack of a branch, the flit and call of birds he has no names for. It is not silent wilderness, it is occupied space, just not by the kinds of creatures he expects. Higher still, on the interior hills of Hispaniola or Cuba, those forests can thin again, becoming cooler, cloud-brushed montane woods, where tree ferns and mosses dominate. Columbus and his men would not have seen all of this on that first approach, but they would have sensed it. The way clouds hang on inner ridges suggests water, height, other climates just beyond the visible belt of shore. The animals complete the picture. Along the beaches and flats, seabirds work the water. Terns, frigate birds, pelicans, tropic birds, wheeling, diving, gliding on long wings. Well before sunrise, sailors could hear them, the guttural croaks, the high, thin cries drifting across the dark water. For navigators trained in Atlantic practice, birds are clues. Certain species mean nearby land, others suggest offshore banks rich in fish. Following flocks at dawn was an old technique. In these archipelagos, it suddenly becomes much more rewarding. There is land in almost every direction. On the islands themselves, much of the large native mammal fauna had been modest to begin with: huteus, agoutis, small rodents, bats. No herds of deer or wild cattle, no wolves, for Spaniards used to landscapes visibly shaped by grazing animals. The quiet of an ungrazed Caribbean hillside might have felt uncanny. Grasses grow tall where they can, seedlings crowd in, thickets close ranks. Without hooves constantly editing them down, many clearings tend to fill themselves. Yet the impression of abundance is overwhelming. Fruit on trees, fish in shallows, shellfish on rocks, manatees in seagrass beds, turtles hauled up to nest on sandy beaches. To people accustomed to extracting a living from harsher seasonal swings, this can look like a kind of Eden. It is easy from a ship to call such a place pristine. That word slips into Columbus's descriptions in other forms: very green, very fertile, without cultivation except a little. The assumption is that what he doesn't recognize as agriculture is simply nature. But Taino communities had been tending and reshaping these islands for centuries. Around villages, forest had been selectively thinned to favour useful species: fruit trees, fibre plants, wood that splits straight for canoes and posts. Understory vegetation could be cleared for gardens, canucos, small mounded fields where cassava, maize, beans and other crops grew together. Fire was used carefully to open patches of land, refresh certain plant communities, and maintain trails. Shorelines near settlements often showed a mosaic. Groves of trees left for shade and food, open areas for canoe landing, patches of managed scrub where building materials and fuelwood could be gathered. From offshore, that mosaic still reads as forest. It is hard to see the fine structure of a garden from half a mile away, just as it is hard to tell the difference between a naturally open glade and one maintained by people with stone axes and patient hands. The wild landscape that so impressed the Spaniards was, in many places, a long inhabited one. Pristine in the sense of lacking European ploughs, yes. Not untouched. Even the timing of their arrival colours what they see. Columbus reaches the islands in October. In the northern Caribbean, this is late wet season, edging toward the drier months. Many trees are in full leaf, some are fruiting. Streams run, pools are brimming. The hurricane season is not technically over, but by mid-October the highest frequency of storms has passed. He is lucky not to meet one directly. Had he come at the height of the dry season, he might have seen browner hills in rain-shadow areas, lower rivers, some ephemeral ponds reduced to cracked mud. Certain flowers would be gone, others just beginning. Bird nesting cycles, turtle arrivals, manatee movements all shift with season. One voyage, a few weeks long, offers a very narrow slice of a much larger ecological rhythm. For a tired crew, those seasonal details distill into blunt impressions. There seems to be water, there seems to be wood, there seems to be food. They see people stepping easily into canoes, walking forest paths barefoot, harvesting plants they do not recognize. From this conclusions follow quickly. The land is generous, the people are content, resources are there for the taking, if properly claimed. Unfamiliarity does the rest. Animals that don't match old world categories are dismissed as little dogs or rabbits, plants as spices vaguely reminiscent of known ones, forests as virgin, if they lack obvious saw marks or fenced plots. Every mislabeling smooths a complex ecosystem into something that fits an existing story about islands, wealth, and empire. So when Columbus writes of these very green islands filled with trees and birds and very good waters, he is not wrong. But what stands out to him, the greenness, the birds, the apparent ease of life, is only one version of the living landscape. Underneath it, paths, gardens, and long-practiced management have been quietly arranging where that green is thickest, which trees dominate, how the wildlife moves. He is stepping into a world that has been curated, not invented by nature alone, and the way he reads that world on first sight will shape everything he tries to do next. Those paths and gardens belong to someone, not in the sense of hedged property lines and parchment deeds, but in the sense that every clearing, every canoe landing, every cluster of fruit trees has a story about who first cut, who planted, who has the right to harvest, and who is expected to share. The people Columbus meets on that first voyage are part of what we call the Taíno world. But Taíno is a label that flattens more than it explains. It bundles together a whole family of related Arawak-speaking communities that had spread through the Greater Antilles and parts of the Bahamas over many centuries. Within that world there were regional dialects, local customs, rivalries, trade partnerships and histories that no European in 1492 could begin to hear, let alone record faithfully. On a map, it looks simple. Islands, each with villages, each with a chief. In reality, political and cultural boundaries ran in different directions. A coastal community at the mouth of a rich river might be more closely tied, through marriage and exchange, to another harbour 2 days' paddle away, than to villages only a few miles inland. People on the northern coast of Hispaniola might share more stories, songs, and ceremonial practices with communities in eastern Cuba than with groups deep in the central mountains of their own island. From the deck of a caravel, all of that is invisible. You see a cluster of houses and a beach full of canoes, and it reads as one thing. Taíno settlements tend to favour just the sort of places Columbus is drawn to. Good anchorages, river mouths, small bays where reefs break the surf and mangroves give way to firmer shore. There, slightly above the highest floods, you might find a village, a ukayak, laid out around a central space that serves as plaza, ball court, dance ground, council area and ceremony stage all at once. The houses themselves are not random huts. They can be large circular or rectangular structures, framed in wood, thatched with palm, their posts sunk into soil, that has seen generations of rebuilding. A big chief's house might shelter many families, each with their own hearth and sleeping spaces partitioned by woven mats and hanging cloths. Around the edges, smaller dwellings cluster like satellites. Just beyond the ring of houses, the gardens spread out. Canucos, mounded fields of dark, friable soil, rise like low waves. Cassava is the backbone crop, its poisonous roots carefully processed into safe, long-keeping bread. Around it grow maize, beans, squash, peppers, tobacco, cotton, and dozens of minor plants used for food, medicine, dye, or ritual. Fruit trees punctuate the patchwork: guava, mamey, various palms. The line between garden and forest is blurred. Useful wild species are encouraged, less useful ones reduced. What looks to a newcomer like random luxuriance is, in fact, the outcome of many small repeated decisions about what to cut, what to spare, what to plant close to home, and what to leave a little farther away. Villages link coast and interior. People do not live only on the beach. Some communities sit on river terraces, upriver, closer to freshwater fishing grounds, fertile soils, or defensible heights. Paths run between them, narrow, well-worn tracks under the trees, marked in memory more than by any sign a European would recognize. A woman in one village might have sisters, cousins, and a final kin in several others, spreading obligations and alliances inland and alongshore. Within this network, leadership is real, but not absolute. Spaniards reach for the word cacique and use it almost the way they use king. The reality is subtler. A cacique is a political and ritual leader, but his power rests on webs of reciprocity. He is expected to receive tribute, cassava bread, cotton, smoked fish, labour at planting or harvest times, and to redistribute rewards, feasts, protection, prestige goods, access to sacred objects and ceremonies. He hosts visiting dignitaries, settles disputes, sponsors communal rituals in which the boundaries between human, ancestor, and spirit are negotiated. His authority often flows through kinship. Marriage alliances connect caciques across valleys and islands. A chief on one coast might be the mother's brother of another chief across the channel, tying their fortunes together. When Europeans later try to conscript labour or demand gold through a single local leader, they are stepping into these pre-existing obligation networks without understanding how fragile and how far-reaching they can be. Below the caciques are other ranked persons, war leaders, ritual specialists, advisors sometimes glossed as nobles in Spanish accounts. There are also commoners whose work maintains gardens, builds houses, paddles canoes, shapes pots, weaves cotton. Certain individuals specialize in carving, curing, midwifery, song. Women's roles are not marginal, they are central in farming, weaving, lineage continuity, and often in ritual life. None of this maps neatly onto European categories of peasant, soldier, priest. Material culture connects these social worlds to the sea. Canoes hollowed from great tree trunks with controlled fire and stone or shell tools are the arteries of Taíno life. Some are small for river and near-shore fishing. Others, described with awe by Spaniards, can carry dozens of people, trading parties, visiting relatives, war expeditions, across channels that look daunting to Europeans accustomed to hugging coasts. Steered with paddles and poles, they move quietly along mangrove creeks, swiftly across open water. In those canoes travel cotton, ceramics, food, and stories. Cotton, spun and woven with considerable skill, becomes shirts, skirts, belts, and ritual sashes, but also fishnets, cords, and bindings. To the Spaniards used to rougher homespun and expensive imported linens, the fineness of some taíno cotton work stands out immediately. It is both everyday and elite, part of household economy and ceremonial display. Ceramics tell another story. Taíno pottery, often decorated with incised patterns or modelled faces of humans and animals, moves between islands as gifts, trade items, and carriers of food or drink. Styles vary by region. An archaeologist can often tell, from a fragment of rim or handle, whether a pot was made locally or brought from afar. For the people using them, these differences might signal origin, status, or the presence of particular ritual substances. Hammocks, hamacas, are one of the most quietly revolutionary things Spaniards encounter. Woven from cotton cords or plant fibres, slung between posts, they are cool, dry, flexible beds in a climate where the ground can be damp and insects persistent. To Taíno households, they are normal furniture. To European sailors used to cramped berths and straw pallets, they are marvels quickly borrowed and carried back across the Atlantic. All of this circulates along trade routes that predate Columbus by generations. Shell ornaments from one island turn up far away. Stone belts used in ball games, beads of semi-precious stone, pigments, tobacco, and ritual paraphernalia move from hand to hand. The sea is not a barrier in this world. It is a road network, with regular traffic and known hazards. Many of the stereotypes that developed later of Taíno as uniformly gentle, passive, living in some vague tropical simplicity, come from viewing this complexity through the wrong lens and through sources already shaped by conquest. Early Spanish narratives are interested in souls to convert and labour to extract, not in fine distinctions between regional traditions. When they mention war, they emphasize wooden weapons and lack of metal armor. When they mention hierarchy, they exaggerate kingship. When they mention abundance, they slip easily into Edenic language that serves imperial needs. Archaeology, oral traditions, and careful reading of scattered descriptions suggest a livelier, more varied picture. Communities that could be hospitable or wary, diplomatic or defiant. Political units that rose, fell and realigned, cultures that had already weathered migrations, internal conflicts and environmental changes long before a European sail cut the horizon. There are gaps we cannot fill. We do not have Taíno-authored histories from before 1492. Names of specific lineages, local myths, village rivalries, the full nuance of ritual speech, all of that is mostly lost or filtered through hostile ears. Where we can, we reconstruct. Where we cannot, we acknowledge uncertainty. But we can say that when Columbus stepped ashore, he was not walking into a blank, innocent new world. He was arriving late to a crowded conversation, a network of Taíno worlds, each with its own arrangements of land, leadership, obligation and exchange. And into that network he brings people who do not speak the language, do not grasp the rules, and are under orders to claim, rename, and report back. The stage is set for misreading on an epic scale. The first thing everyone shares is silence. Not a peaceful, empty silence, but the charged pause between people who can see one another clearly and have almost no shared way to speak. On one side, men in unfamiliar clothes stepping down from boats, crossing wet sand, carrying objects that gleam and clink and catch the sun. On the other, people whose home beach this is, fishers, gardeners, children kin of local leaders. Both groups have spent their lives meeting strangers from other villages, other islands. Both have protocols for this. None of those protocols quite fit what is happening. There is no common language. Columbus and his crew do not know Arawak. The islanders do not know Castilian, Portuguese or Latin, so communication defaults to the oldest tools humans have: gesture, tone, posture, the offering and accepting of objects. A hand placed over the heart, a slight bow, open arms held away from weapons. Smiles or something like them, pointing to the sky, to the ships, to the village, touching one's own chest while saying a name, repeating it, hoping that this will be understood as "this is what I am called," and not as a spell or a challenge. Objects become sentences. A sailor holds out a bell, a glass bead, a worn metal knife. The islander takes it, weighs it, tests the edge, turns it in the light. In return, maybe a parrot, a cotton thread, a woven belt, a handful of food. None of these gifts are neutral. In Taíno worlds, giving and receiving can signal curiosity, hospitality, obligation, or the opening moves of an alliance. In Iberian worlds, gifts can mark submission, tribute, or the gracious acceptance of the superior party's favour. Neither side knows exactly which script the other is following, but both act as if the other must understand. Columbus, writing later, will say the people gave all they had freely, as if without property, as if this proves simplicity or innocence. Another reading is possible, that the islanders are doing what good diplomats do when powerful strangers arrive. They lower the temperature. They treat unknown visitors like guests rather than enemies, at least at first. A small gift can be a way of testing intentions, buying time, and establishing that whatever comes next, it is happening on their shore, under their watch. Behind this trading of objects is a deeper mismatch, the mental categories each side uses to sort the world. Columbus has been told he may find kings, princes, lords in these lands, perhaps great urbane rulers, like those described in Tales of Cathay. When he asks about authority, he listens for signs that point neatly to these familiar types. A single named leader, a central town, a hierarchy that looks like a miniature version of Castile. So when local people mention a cacique, gesture inland or along the coast, point to the better-built house, he hears king. When he sees people bringing food to a central figure, he sees subject and tribute. When canoes arrive with cotton and food from another village, he writes of markets and traders because those are the words he has. The islanders are doing something similar in reverse. They have their own categories: guests, kin, trading partners, rivals, raiders, people of the next island over, spirits that travel in bodies that look human but are not quite. They see bearded men in metal and cloth, arriving in huge wooden things with wings, and have to slot them somewhere in this existing grid. Are they human? Are they strange raiders from another region with different weapons and customs? Are they powerful but still within the known range of people who might be kin? Or are they closer to dangerous beings from stories, to be handled with extreme caution? Caution and curiosity exist side by side. Some villagers stay close, watching every move. Others hang back under cover of trees, or slip canoes into side creeks to warn inland kin. If there is a recognized local leader nearby, runners go to tell him. When that leader appears, perhaps not on the first day, but soon after, he does not walk alone. He comes with advisors, relatives, people who know the reef channels, people who can size up strangers' tools and bodies. He may decide to meet these newcomers in a place of his choosing, instead of letting them march uninvited into the heart of the village. He may arrange for young men with spears or clubs to be out of obvious sight, but not far away. He may instruct his people quietly on what to say and what not to say. Information in this setting is a resource, telling newcomers exactly where your gardens are, where your freshwater springs run, which neighbouring group you are feuding with, that can empower them in ways you cannot predict or control. So early conversations are partial by design. Directions given with broad gestures rather than precise ones. Vague answers to questions about gold or other valuables, if those questions are even understood. At the same time, the islanders are gathering data of their own. How disciplined are these men? Do they move like experienced warriors or clumsy landlubbers? How many ships, how many visible weapons? Do they touch women respectfully or carelessly? Do they seem to understand that certain spaces, ball courts, ritual areas, particular houses have special status? Each side is testing. Each side is reading the other through its own stories. Now layer onto this the problem of memory and writing. Only one party is keeping a written journal that will survive. Columbus notes that the people seem without religion because he does not see churches, altars, or familiar priestly garments. He notes that they seem without iron or weapons because he does not count wooden clubs with inlaid sharp shells or polished stone axes as real arms. He writes that they are timid because, when Spanish crossbows are fired, they step back and murmur instead of charging. Every line like that is an interpretation hardened into apparent fact. Take a single small scene. An islander touches a sailor's sword, accidentally cuts his hand, is startled, laughs, and withdraws. One version, written in the journal, they know not the use of arms, and are so simple that they take the edge in their hands. Another possible reading, he is testing the stranger's mettle, discovers its danger, masks his alarm with laughter, and makes a mental note about just how sharp these visitors' tools are. Or consider the exchange of a feathered headdress for a few glass beads. In one narrative, this is a poor islander trading away a symbol of high status for trinkets, proof of naivete, and the low value of such objects here. In another, the headdress might not be the most sacred of regalia at all, but a secondary item, given as a calculated, generous gift to secure goodwill and see what the strangers are willing to offer for things they clearly desire. The same moment can be read as submission, as equal exchange, as cautious testing, or even as an attempt at spiritual protection, placing dangerous newcomers under a web of obligations by giving them something that carries ritual weight. Because Columbus must report to patrons and monarchs across the sea, his versions gain institutional backing. A fleeting impression these people would make good servants can become a premise in later policy. A casual observation that a certain cacique came joyfully to the shore can be repeated as proof that the land was willingly taken possession of in the sovereign's name. The journal solidifies a messy, layered, ambiguous encounter into something flatter. Hospitality becomes consent, curiosity becomes simplicity, uncertainty becomes certainty. Yet beneath those written lines, multiple realities probably coexisted. Some islanders may indeed have found the strangers wondrous and disarming, approaching in frank openness. Others, perhaps elders who remembered earlier raids or rumours of violent visitors from other islands, may have urged restraint. Some young men might have been fascinated by metal and cloth. Others may have measured distances to trees and rocks, quietly considering what would happen if those strange thunder weapons failed or ran out of shot. The miscommunication is not just about vocabulary. It is about motives, expectations, and stories people tell themselves afterward. Columbus thinks he has begun a series of diplomatic relations, perhaps the first steps toward trade, conversion, and royal claims. Many of the islanders may think they have contained a potential problem, steered it towards certain harbours and away from others, and perhaps found new partners or new threats that can be woven, with care, into an already complex regional web. They do not yet know which reading will prevail. What they share in that first span of days is the sense that they are looking at something unprecedented and trying, each in their own language, to make it fit. The first filter that clicks into place in Columbus's mind is not wonder. It is inventory. He has been sent with instructions, and those instructions are very specific. Look for gold, look for spices, look for large cities, rich ports, navigable rivers, signs of powerful rulers. Look for markers that say, in the shorthand of European court politics, this venture is worth the risk. So even as he is still puzzling out gestures and exchanging gifts on the beach, a quiet checklist is running. Skin tone, ornaments, cloth, weapons. Are there metal blades, or only stone and wood? Are any of the necklaces glinting with gold, or is that polished shell? Do people point inland when he mimes mining, or do they point along the coast? Are there masts of other large ships beyond the reef? Do they say, with hands and words he cannot fully understand, that the great king lives somewhere over there? The questions he asks are shaped by the world he left. In that world, tales of Asia are heavy with incense and saffron and cinnamon, with cities of marvellous size and innumerable peoples. Monarchs at court imagine caravans loaded with pepper and pearls. They think of ports like Lisbon or Venice, then scale them up, place them at the far edge of the ocean, and ask their captains to find an equivalent. So when Columbus lands on small, low islands fringed with mangroves and scattered villages, he does not take them at face value. He treats them as outer stepping stones, the thin provincial rim of something greater inland. There must be larger islands, and beyond those a mainland. There must be cities, because the stories of Marco Polo say there are cities. If he does not see them yet, then he must be at the outskirts. Tiny things become evidence. A faint yellow thread in a nose ring that might be gold, a worn bit of metal hanging from a cord that does not match any Spanish design, a scrap of cotton in a colour he thinks could be the kind of cloth one finds in India. Each small anomaly becomes a signpost. If this man has a bit of gold in his ear, then somewhere nearby there must be more. If this woman wears a coppery bell that looks slightly foreign, then it might have come from trade with another people further on. That, in turn, suggests other ships, other coasts, perhaps the longed-for great river that opens into the heart of a continent. In the journal, the logic runs like this. They have a little, therefore there is much. They show me one nugget, therefore there must be mines. They speak an unfamiliar word while pointing to the south. Therefore in that direction lies a kingdom rich in metal and spices. Each uncertain gesture becomes an arrow on an invisible map he is sketching in his head. From the perspective of his patrons, this is exactly what he is supposed to do. He is not an impartial observer wandering through strange lands. He is an agent sent to gather proof. Letters from Lisbon speak of spices changing the balance of power in Europe. Reports from the Mediterranean remind everyone that control of trade routes can make or break empires. Columbus must come back with more than stories of pleasant beaches and generous hosts. He must come back with signs that wealth exists and can be tapped. So he begins to scout in a very particular way. Every time the ships anchor off a new bay, questions follow the first greetings. Where is gold? He points to a ring, mimics digging, shapes a mountain with his hands. Where is Tipango, his imagined Japan? He draws a larger land on the air, taps his own chest to indicate desire, points outward. Where are spices? He smells leaves and roots, tastes them, tries to match them to cargo lists in his memory. When islanders point toward other islands, gesture along the chain, name places he cannot pronounce, he strings those sounds into a chain of rumour. This island has gold, that one has spices, the next has a king with much metal. Whether they are telling him what they think he wants to hear, or simply describing a complex web of regional trade, he receives it as confirmation that the real prizes lie always one voyage further on. This is not just about spoken words. He reads geography itself as though it were a treasure map left for him to decode. A river mouth wide enough for his ships becomes a potential route inland towards cities. A sheltered harbour with deep water suggests a future port that could handle fleets. Hills that glow in certain light might be read as gold-bearing because back home such colours sometimes mean veins of ore beneath the surface. A village with more substantial houses becomes a principal town. A house slightly larger than the rest becomes the residence of the king. Any sign of surplus, extra stores of cassava, more cotton hammocks, better crafted canoes is interpreted as a first step on a ladder that must eventually reach up to something like Seville or Genoa, only in India. But the economies he is walking through obey different logics. These islands are part of regional networks where wealth is measured in fertile gardens, good fishing grounds, healthy kin, ritual objects charged with meaning, canoes that move quickly between cays. Gold may exist, but as an occasional ornament, a soft, attractive metal that catches the sun, not yet the fixed backbone of a currency system. Spices in the European sense, pepper shipped by the ton. Cloves from distant trees, nutmeg from guarded islands, are not what locals are cultivating. They have their own prized plants for medicine, flavour, and ritual, but not the specific commodities that European courts crave. From this gap, expectations do strange things. Columbus sees a fragrant root and wonders if it could be a kind of cinnamon. He notes that the people have cotton and imagines future plantations. He hears that 2 days' sail away there are people who wear clothes and carry arms, and fits this into his hope for Asian-style kingdoms. Each rumour grows as it travels up the chain of command, from sailor to captain to monarch, because each step adds interpretation. What he does not carefully record are the many signs that point in other directions, the intricate knowledge of reefs and tides, the cooperative labour clearing fields and tending cassava, the ceremonial exchanges that redistribute food and cloth. To him, these are background details, not the main story. They do not look like the wealth he has been sent to find, so they slide to the edges of the narrative. In this way, expectation becomes a lens. He notices gold-coloured glints and notes them, sometimes with precise-sounding measurements, this much dust, that many nose ornaments, a river where I saw sand that seemed to contain gold. He pays attention to anything that can be translated into familiar currency, metal, spices, potential slaves, future tribute. What he is less likely to dwell on are the absences from his wish list. No sprawling walled cities, no stone harbours crowded with merchant ships, no obvious equivalents to the sultans and emperors in his books. Those gaps are patched over with the assumption that all these things exist somewhere just beyond the horizon. In his journal, the world he sees is quietly bent toward the world he hopes to see. Beaches and villages become outskirts of imagined metropolises. Simple ornaments become proof of nearby mines. Hints and rumours become signs that he is, as he tells himself and his sponsors, close, so very close to the Asia he promised to reach. On the sand and in the villages, life continues at its own pace, according to its own measures of value. In the pages that sail back across the Atlantic, a different picture is taking shape, one in which a chain of islands is already being recast as the vestibule to someone else's treasure house, waiting in European eyes to be opened. All of this imagining the invisible cities, the mines just out of sight, has to pass through a very narrow physical bottleneck. Getting from ship to shore. The big hulks that carried him across the Atlantic cannot simply glide up to the beach. They draw too much water. The sandbars and reefs that make the islands so beautiful also make them dangerous. A wrong approach angle, a hidden coral head, and a ship's hull can be torn open like a fruit rind. So almost every encounter you're picturing is filtered through a small routine, repeated again and again. Soundings with a weighted line to check depth. Sails furled, anchors dropped in what seems like safe water, sometimes half a mile or more from land. Then the slow, creaking business of lowering boats. These ship's boats are not limitless. A few longboats, a skiff, perhaps a canoe acquired locally. Each has to be swung out on tackles, eased down, steadied in the swell by men whose arms are already shaking from weeks of work and poor sleep. Then they are loaded, people, barrels, casks, tools, carefully, because one clumsy shift of weight where surf meets shoal can flip everything. The last bit is the hardest. From the anchored ships, the shore looks close and calm. From the boat, the coastline changes personality. Swells steepen in the shallows. Waves break unexpectedly over sandbars. The men at the oars must time their strokes with the rise and fall of the surf, nudge the prow to avoid being turned sideways, brace themselves for the jolt when keel meets sand. There is no neat stone quay, no harbour crane, no organised reception. Landing is wet and chaotic. Boots in water, shoulders under the gunwales, men heaving the boat higher up the sand before the next wave sucks it back. Everything that steps onto the beach does so tired, damp, and slightly off balance. Behind them, the ships ride at anchor in the uncertain light. Anchors themselves are part of the story of control. A good anchorage is protection. A bad one is a trap. If the bottom is rocky, cables can chafe and part. If the wind shifts overnight, a ship can drag anchor toward the very reefs it tried to avoid. In a storm, there is a real possibility of losing a vessel entirely, with all hands and supplies. So each day's exploration is actually tethered by a line of rope disappearing under the sea, and by the silent question, can we get back to the ship? This is where the ceremonial taking possession on a beach and the reality of power pull sharply apart. On paper, in letters and reports, a landing plus a prayer plus a flag equals a new territory for a distant crown. In lived experience, a few dozen exhausted men standing on a strip of sand are not masters of anything. They are surrounded by an environment they do not fully understand, relying on tools that can be smashed by a single storm, within sight of a forest or mangrove screen behind which they have no idea who is watching. Numbers make this fragility obvious. The 3 ships do not disgorge thousands of soldiers. They carry in total a crew small enough that everyone's name can be listed. Any landing party is a fraction of that number, a handful to hold the boats, a handful to go inland, a few to guard the piles of traded goods and precious water casks. On the islands, by contrast, people know the footpaths, the fishing spots, the hidden channels through the mangroves. They can move by canoe along the coast faster than a lumbering European boat can be rowed. They have relatives on other quays, places to disappear to, alternate gardens inland. The strangers on the beach have none of that. So control, at first, runs mostly one way. The newcomers depend heavily on local guidance. If someone points to a spring of fresh water, that spring becomes the centre of operations. If they gesture to a safe place to beach the boats, that cove becomes the harbour. If they indicate that over there is a good path inland, the strangers follow, weapons ready, but trusting that their guides are not leading them into a swamp or a dead end. Water, especially, governs the rhythm of these first days. The ships have casks, but casks empty. Men in tropical heat dehydrate faster than they expect. Salt pork and biscuit do not replenish lost moisture. Without reliable access to fresh water on land, no amount of flags or proclamations can turn a beach into a base. Food is the same story in another form. Shipboard stores are deliberately dry and dense. Flour, biscuit, legumes, salted meat. They keep men alive, but they do not keep them well. Fresh fruit, roots, and fish become prized. That means fishing from small boats near unfamiliar reefs, or accepting food from islanders, cassava bread, roasted fish, fruit, things pulled from gardens and forests that the newcomers cannot yet identify. Each bite is a mixture of relief and risk. They do not know which plants might be toxic. They do not know which waterholes might sicken them. Yet they need what the land and its people offer, because the sea alone cannot support a prolonged stay. Nightfall sharpens all of this. The ships are safer from attack, but more vulnerable to wind. The shore is closer to resources but full of unknowns. Do you sleep aboard, shuttling by boat in the dim hours of dawn and dusk? Or do you establish a camp on land, with makeshift shelters and a ring of tired men on watch? A bad choice can be fatal. A storm that comes in fast after your boats have gone ashore can leave men stranded without a clear way back. A camp placed slightly too near a river mouth can flood. A site chosen for its good view might be exposed to wind and rain, leaving men shivering and their powder damp. In such conditions, bravado in the journal sits on top of a constant prickling awareness of vulnerability. Diplomacy, too, is shaped by this imbalance. When you know that you and a few dozen companions can be surrounded at any time, every gesture of friendliness from locals is precious, and every sign of hostility is magnified. A frown, a spear held slightly higher, a group that vanishes into the trees can become cause for alarm. So Columbus's tone in his writing oscillates. On the one hand, claims of certainty, phrases about taking possession, descriptions of the people as gentle, easily managed, suitable for service. On the other, repeated mentions of needing pilots, needing interpreters, needing to find good harbours, good anchorages, good water. Underneath the language of command runs a steady current of dependency. The narratives that make it back to Europe, however, tend to smooth away the shakiness. They emphasize the plantings of crosses, the renaming of bays, the apparent obedience of islanders when confronted with banners and prayers. They do not dwell on the awkward scrambles through surf, the nights when lightning flashed and anchors dragged, the mornings spent anxiously scanning the tree line to see who would emerge. Yet for the people actually stepping from longboat to sand, these were the most immediate realities. A ship that might part its cables in a sudden squall, a shoreline that might hide rocks or people, a water source that might run dry, a guide whose patience might wear thin. In that narrow zone where sea gives way to land, control was not yet an accomplished fact. It was an aspiration projected ahead of experience, much like those invisible cities still hovering, in Columbus's mind, somewhere beyond the next headland. On that narrow strip of sand, possession is tentative and physical. On paper, it is something else entirely. The moment Columbus steps ashore, another process begins. Not with muskets or fortifications, but with ink, with words, with the decision to call a place by a name that did not belong to it yesterday. For the islanders, the land is already partitioned and understood, but not as dots on a chart. A bay might be where the spirits breathe because of the way the wind funnels through a gap. A headland might be named for a famous ancestor, or for a storm, or for the way turtles come ashore there every spring. The same beach can have one name for fishermen, another for farmers, another used only in ritual. None of this is written down in the way Europeans expect, yet it is precise. Children learn which inlet is safe in a north wind, which creek runs brackish at low tide, which grove belongs to which lineage. Boundaries are remembered through stories, through who married whom, through obligations to share a certain patch of garden or reef. Into this thick, lived geography comes a man who is determined to call the first land he sees San Salvador. Holy Saviour. The name does a lot of quiet work. It thanks a Christian God for deliverance across the ocean. It signals to the Crown and to future readers that this land has been claimed within a Christian frame. It gently erases whatever the islanders have been calling it, even if that older name still circulates in daily speech. Every new bay, every headland, every anchorage will get the same treatment. La Concepción, Santa Maria de la Concepción, Española, Isla Juana. Saints, monarchs, abstractions, names that make more sense in Seville than they do under the Caribbean sun. Names that tie these coasts to court politics, to dynastic hopes, to religious calendars. And once something has a European name, it can be written into a European map. Those early maps, though, are strangely thin compared to the realities they purport to capture. Columbus is not cruising slowly along every curve of shoreline with a modern chart plotter. He is snatching glimpses between rain squalls, counting estimated leagues between anchorages, noting where a compass points when he sees land. His pilots sketch arcs and angles by dead reckoning, trying to line up remembered bearings with hurried soundings. So the first charts of these islands are rough guesses stretched over hope. Long, smooth coastlines where in reality there are dozens of inlets. Islands drawn too close together, or too far apart, because the current pushed the ships more than anyone realized. Bays exaggerated into harbours, or harbours missed entirely. They are not lies, they are simplifications forced by the limits of time, tools, and perspective. But simplification has consequences. On a Taino canoe route, a passage between two cays is a place of cross-currents, shoals, favoured fishing spots, stories about a shark that once overturned a boat. On a European chart, that same space becomes a narrow strait between two labelled masses of land, its interior life reduced to a couple of soundings and a note about good shelter from the north. When you smooth a jagged, inhabited coastline into a clean curve, you also smooth out the people who live along it. A place that, for its own inhabitants, is a weave of gardens, fishing grounds, sacred sites, and kin territories becomes, on paper, one island among many, suitable to be granted, traded, or administered. A homeland becomes quietly an asset. This is the real power of names and maps in 1492. They do not just describe, they authorize. If a bay is Bahia de la Concepción on a royal chart, it can be included in a grant to some future governor who has never seen it. If a cluster of islands is collectively called the Indies and drawn as stepping stones on the way to imagined Asian markets, their existing networks of alliance and rivalry fade from view. They become, in European eyes, islands to be used as way stations for fleets, as sources of labour, as proof that a voyage was worth financing, used as lines of latitude and longitude on which to hang future ambitions. Even the distortions become part of the story. A cape sketched slightly too far west can later be invoked as evidence that this or that explorer reached the continent first. An island misjudged in size can be described as vast and rich in reports, because the map seems to support the fantasy. A mistaken belief that Cuba is part of Asia can linger for years, because a chart drawn from faulty bearings is copied and recopied, each engraver smoothing lines a little more, each caption writer a little less cautious. By the time those maps reach desks in Barcelona, Rome, Antwerp, they no longer feel like guesses. They look authoritative, neat borders inked in, names aligned in elegant script. Sea monsters pushed politely toward the blank edges, the nervous landings through surf, the hurried consultation with islanders about where to find water, have all been transformed into confident coastlines. And when later generations, cartographers, chroniclers, schoolteachers, look back at those early charts, they interpret them through the lens of what came after. If you know that a Spanish colony called Santo Domingo will one day dominate part of this region, you tend to see early scribbles of La Isla Española as the obvious beginning of that story. If you know that the Americas will become, in European thought, a new world, you are less likely to notice that, on the first maps, they are still awkward, uncertain appendages to Asia. Copies breed certainty. A cautious annotation in one pilot's chart becomes a firm label in a later atlas. A guess about a river's mouth becomes a fixed feature. The more the image circulates, the more it overwrites other ways of seeing the same shores. The indigenous mental maps, paths linked to planting times, reefs to clan histories, do not vanish on the ground. People keep living by them, sailing by them, telling them to their children. But on European paper, another geography settles in on top like a transparent sheet. Old names blur under new ones, old centres of meaning become peripheral unless they line up with anchorages, fort sites, or profitable resources. a place that has been lived in for centuries can, with a few strokes of a quill, be framed as newly discovered, newly available, newly empty of the kinds of claims that European law recognises. This is how 1492 begins to acquire its later myth. Not as a moment when nothing existed before and everything began, but as a moment when one set of names and lines started to crowd another off the page, when an event that, in lived experience, was just one more encounter between sea travellers and islanders was declared, in writing and mapping, to be a starting point. The bay where Columbus first planted a cross is, in Taíno memory, one episode in a much longer story of that coast. In European charts and chronicles it becomes the first, and once something is labelled the first on enough maps and in enough books, it becomes harder, centuries later, to remember that the world it points to was already ancient, already mapped in other minds, long before any European name touched that sand. Those books and maps have another, quieter companion. The journal, when most people imagine Columbus's voyage, they picture him hunched over a table by lantern light, recording each day's events in a leather-bound volume that still sits somewhere in a glass case. That book does not exist. What we have is already one step removed. Columbus most likely kept a working ship's log, rough and practical. Courses, estimated distances, soundings, wind directions, short notes about land seen, islands entered, people met, signs of gold. Something a pilot and captain could use to navigate and later reconstruct the voyage. That original log is gone. What survives is a later summary, written by Columbus himself after he returned, and then a further condensed and edited version of that summary, produced by Bartolomé de las Casas decades afterward. So, when you read Columbus's journal, you are really peering through at least two layers of glass. First, Columbus looks back over his notes and reworks them into a narrative for the crown. Already he knows who his audience is, monarchs anxious about expenses, rivals looking for weakness, courtiers hungry for stories of marvels. He chooses which days to dwell on, which to skim. He emphasizes dangers overcome, opportunities discovered, moments that make him look bold, devout, and indispensable. Then, years later, Las Casas copies that account out, abbreviates some portions, paraphrases others, and occasionally inserts his own clarifying comments. He too has an agenda. Las Casas is trying to defend indigenous peoples against abuse, while still working within a Spanish imperial framework. He wants to show that these islanders are gentle, rational, capable of conversion. That means he might highlight their generosity, downplay their resistance, and sharpen any evidence that they were wronged. By the time the text reaches a modern reader, it has passed through multiple hands, languages, and purposes. Italian or Genoese speech rendered into 15th century Castilian. 15th century Castilian copied in 16th century hands. Early modern phrasing translated into modern Spanish, English, French. With each pass, choices are made. A phrase that might in one century sound cautious can, in another language, feel confident. A description that was originally hedged, it seems, they say it might be, can flatten into it is. Words used casually for servant or subject in one context can be read later on as hard evidence of slavery or sovereignty. Tone leaks away or gets added by accident. Is Columbus awed or calculating when he says the islanders would make good Christians and good servants? Does a sentence that sounds benevolent in one translation carry a sharper edge in another? How much of that is Columbus, and how much is the translator unconsciously smoothing or sharpening his voice? Even simple details are slippery. Distances are given in leagues that may not match modern estimates. Directions are relative to a moving ship, and a compass that does not yet have a fully understood variation. Numbers of men, of canoes, of houses can be rounded up or down to make a point. And then there is the framing. Every entry is written by a man who knows his career and honour rest on this venture being seen as a success. He has strong incentives. emphasize how quickly the islanders submit, how eagerly they bring food and gifts. Minimize episodes that might look like quarrels, miscommunications, or outright refusals. Present uncertainty about geography in ways that still sound promising. If this island is not Sipangu, perhaps the next one is. If there is little gold here, perhaps it is in the mountains just out of sight. You can hear this in the rhythm of the surviving text. Descriptions of harbours are often balanced by suggestions that they would be ideal for future settlements. Observations about people's bodies, ornaments, and rituals are often funneled toward practical conclusions. They seem healthy, industrious, or fearful enough to be ruled. They seem ignorant enough of iron that Spanish weapons will give an advantage. None of this means the journal is useless or deliberately false. It means it is a crafted document, part reconnaissance report, part justification, part personal diary, part sales pitch to ensure more ships, more men, more backing. So how do historians work with something like this, especially when the original is gone and only copies of copies remain? They triangulate. An entry describing a broad bay with good anchorage is checked against modern coastlines, soundings, and satellite images. Does any inlet on that part of the island match the described shelter from certain winds, the reported sailing time from the previous landfall, the sight lines to nearby cays or headlands? Archaeology adds more layers. If a site that matches the described geography also contains late 15th century European metal, glass beads or pig bones in indigenous layers, confidence grows that this is one of the places described. If Taíno villages in that area show sudden changes in pottery, diet, or settlement pattern right after 1492, those shifts can be linked back to the patterns sketched in the journal. Ecology plays a part. Columbus mentions dense forests, cotton fields, or certain kinds of birds and fish. Botanists and zoologists can say which islands at that time plausibly supported those species in that combination. Pollen cores from lakes, charcoal layers from ancient fires, and records of when particular crops or animals were introduced help refine the picture. Linguistics enters quietly. Place names recorded in the journal, however distorted by Spanish spelling, can be compared with known Taíno roots and with names that survive, sometimes faintly, in later maps or local traditions. The words Columbus writes down for gold, village, or chief become clues about which dialects he was hearing, and therefore which communities he met. And then there are other voices. Later voyages by Spaniards, Portuguese, and others revisit some of the same coasts. They bring new descriptions of harbours, villages, and routes, sometimes confirming and sometimes contradicting the first accounts. Missionary reports, administrative documents, and indigenous testimonies where they survive allow historians to see patterns that one journal alone could never reveal. When several independent lines of evidence converge, a journal entry, an anchorage that matches artifacts in the ground, ecological traces, consistent place names, historians grow more confident. When the trail depends on a single ambiguous phrase, a lone map caption, or a translation choice, they stay cautious. This is why serious histories of 1492 often sound full of maybes, probablys, and, on balance, it appears. It is not because nothing can be known. It is because the surviving sources were never neutral windows to begin with. They are mirrors, angled and polished for specific eyes. For our sleepy reconstruction, this matters in a simple way. When you imagine Columbus gliding toward a certain beach at dawn, speaking to certain islanders in halting gestures, you are following a path laid down by someone who wanted to be seen in a particular light. You can still walk that path. You can still picture the sails, the reefs, the painted bodies in the surf. But it helps to remember where the ground is firm and where it gets soft. Firm when archaeology, ecology, linguistics, and multiple texts all reinforce the same picture. Soft when the only witness is a man who had every reason to present discovery as smooth, inevitable, and ordained. Holding both in mind the power of the journal and its limits, lets the scene of 1492 become more complex, and strangely more human. It is not a flawless record carved in stone. It is a story told in real time, edited, retold, and interpreted again and again, all the way down to you listening now, somewhere far from that first shoreline, letting the layers of ink and memory settle into the dark. Once you see the journal as a crafted lens, the next question is simple. What did that lens miss? If you only read the entries, the first weeks in the islands can feel strangely gentle. Gifts exchanged, bodies admired, curiosity on both sides. A few nervous moments with bows and spears quickly smoothed over. Columbus repeatedly notes how easily the islanders smile, how readily they bring food and water, how little iron or hardened weapons they seem to have. From his perspective, this can look like peace, but peace is not the same thing as balance. From the moment those ships appeared on the horizon, the situation was asymmetrical in ways that no one present could fully grasp. Start with the simplest layer, information. Columbus arrives with a mental map of Asia that is wrong but coherent. He has a chain of command, written orders, a sense of being the edge of a much larger system. The Taíno he meets have rich knowledge of their own sea, their own neighbours, their own histories. But they have no concept of a distant monarchy that can send fleets across entire oceans, no experience of an empire that thinks in decades and continents. Both sides see each other as small groups on a beach. Only one side is backed by a world that extends thousands of miles behind the horizon. That difference quietly shapes everything that follows. Then there is the logic Columbus carries in his head, the one his sponsors expect him to apply. From the first days, he is not just meeting people, he is evaluating. Who might be willing guides? Who might be useful captives? Which harbours could shelter future expeditions? Where is there fresh water, timber for masts, fertile soil, signs of gold? Even in friendly moments, exchanging red caps for parrots, strings of glass beads for cotton, there is a constant undercurrent of appraisal. He notes which men seem to have authority. He singles them out for special treatment, gifts and flattery, and in some cases for abduction. This is where the extraction logic begins. The first captives are often described as interpreters, people taken for their own good to see Spain, to be returned later with gifts and knowledge. But behind the soft wording is a hard pattern. Valuable human beings removed from their communities, repurposed to serve distant interests. Guides are sometimes volunteers, sometimes not. A man who knows a neighbouring island's currents and reefs may find himself required to lead armed strangers there. Refusal is dangerous when those strangers carry steel blades and can project violence farther and faster than any canoe. And once that pattern starts, it spreads. If gold is mentioned in passing, the mention is recorded, highlighted, chased. A casual gesture toward mountains becomes a reason to sail on, to push farther, to demand more information from people who may not understand what is really being asked or promised. All of this happens while the surface interactions remain, at times almost idyllic. Canoes full of fruit and fish come out to meet the ships. Islanders dive for trinkets, laugh, call out. Spaniards marvel at the clarity of the water, the abundance of trees, the softness of the air. Underneath, invisible forces are already at work. The 3 ships have crossed an ocean, but the microbe clouds around the men on board have come with them. Bacteria in their mouths and intestines, viruses in their blood, pathogens that have circulated through densely populated European towns and countryside for centuries, many of them cycling between humans and domestic animals. The Taíno world is different. Their villages have pigs, dogs, small animals, but not the crowded barnyards of Europe. Their population density is lower. Their webs of disease history are tuned to another set of infections. When outsiders arrive, new pathogens slip silently ashore with them. You will not find Columbus calmly announcing in his journal that he has brought smallpox or measles. The catastrophic epidemics that tear through the Caribbean come in waves over the following decades, not days. But vulnerability is not something that begins when the first rash appears. It begins the moment two previously separate disease pools touch. Each handshake, each shared bowl of food, each night spent ashore by a sailor with a cough becomes a possible bridge. Island ecologies are vulnerable in another way too. The first voyage is cautious about releasing animals, but seeds, insect eggs, and stowaways travel without permission. A rat scuttling down a hawser, weed seeds caught in fodder, microbes in bilge water, small, unremarkable things that in enclosed island systems can alter food chains, compete with local species, and over time reshape forests and coasts. The same principle applies to human communities. Taíno societies are not helpless or simple. They have chiefs, regional networks, rivalries, and long experience managing conflict and alliance across islands. When a powerful stranger appears, some leaders see opportunity. If these newcomers have sharp metal and no old grudges, perhaps they can be drawn into existing rivalries. Perhaps they can help in a dispute with a neighbouring chief. Perhaps an alliance, sealed with gifts and hospitality, will bring prestige. From the other side, Columbus sees these relationships in his own familiar terms: vassals, subjects, friends of the crown, enemies to be punished. He may misread a gesture of ritual welcome as a sign of submission. He may interpret provisioning as tribute. He begins to speak even in the first weeks, as if certain chiefs now belong to the monarchs of Castile and Aragon. These mismatched understandings can be harmless at first. Everyone smiles, everyone nods. Canoes keep bringing cassava bread, and iron tools keep changing hands. But the gap between what each side thinks is happening can widen very quickly. A Taíno leader who believes he is cementing a flexible relationship between equals may be shocked when his refusal to provide more food or labour is treated as rebellion. A Spanish captain who assumes these people are now our subjects may react with force to what is, in local terms, a normal assertion of autonomy. The presence of a few dozen armed foreigners can tilt local balances of power. If one chief gains access to their weapons or their blessing, neighbouring chiefs lose relative ground. Old tensions can flare into open conflict, now sharpened by steel blades and the implied backing of distant kings. Alliances form that would never have existed without the ships, and because the newcomers can leave when things become unstable, the consequences of those new alliances are often borne most heavily by those who remain. This is why historians sometimes speak of 1492 as a hinge, not because everything changed overnight, or because Columbus alone caused what followed, but because multiple slow-moving processes, European expansion, indigenous politics, ecological vulnerability, microbial evolution, suddenly intersected in a very tight space. A few weeks of apparently cordial contact carry within them the logic of later conquest, taking hostages to ensure compliance, demanding more information about resources, assuming that planting a flag or saying a formulaic phrase creates legal ownership. At the same time, local decisions matter. Some chiefs choose to welcome. Others watch from a distance. Some individuals board the ships willingly. Others resist, flee or fight. Iberian court politics, rival European powers, debates within Spain about the legality and morality of conquest. All these will shape what comes next. 1492 is less a single spark, and more a point where many long-burning fuses meet. On the beach, none of that is visible. You have people exchanging names in two languages they barely share, pointing at stars, laughing at each other's clothes, feeling the surprising weight of iron or the surprising warmth of a stranger's hand. In the background, invisible threads are already tightening. Microbes looking for new hosts, seeds waiting in ballast, rumours carrying stories of bearded men and floating houses from one island to the next, plans forming in distant palaces for follow-up voyages with more ships, more men, and more rigid expectations. The journal preserves the surface of those first encounters. To see what changed immediately, you have to imagine the things nobody yet knew how to write down, the tiny exchanges that altered immune systems, the shifting loyalties between villages, the quiet decisions of individual sailors and islanders that would, added together, guide the next ships that crossed the sea. If you let all of this settle, the scene in your mind may already feel different. Not 3 tiny ships arriving at an empty paradise, but uncertain vessels nosing along an unfamiliar coast, guided by fallible navigation, written instructions, and a head full of wrong but confident maps. A commander who cannot say exactly where he is, only where he hopes he might be. A landfall that later scholars will argue over for centuries, precisely because the descriptions are the work of tired eyes and hurried notes, not a modern GPS trace. The islands themselves are not blank green smudges. They are lived-in places, gardens cut from forest by generations of work, canoe routes known as clearly as roads, fishing grounds that have their own names, their own owners, their own stories, sacred groves, burial caves, borders between chiefdoms that you cannot see from the deck of a caravel, but that everyone on shore understands. Columbus does not walk into a silent, untouched world. He steps into a human landscape already dense with meaning. And yet, what survives to us is heavily filtered. We have his journal, but not theirs. We have letters to monarchs, reports to royal councils, later retellings written to satisfy patrons, to justify expenses, to turn complex events into simple stories of triumph, or sometimes of tragedy and moral warning. In those documents, the uncertainty is often smoothed away. Distances become neat estimates. Harbours are described as if their value is obvious and permanent. The shifting weather, the nerves of the crew, the misread gestures across cultures, those all get condensed into a line or two. Over time, expectation hardens into memory. Columbus arrives sure he is nearing Asia, so he describes what he sees in Asian terms. Islands of the Indies, signs of Chipangu, people who might be guided toward Christianity and royal service. Europe reads his words with its own categories in place: subjects and savages, gold and spices, empty lands and rightful claims. Later centuries build still another layer. Schoolbook versions need a clear starting point, a clean cause. So the tangled story of many peoples and many voyages becomes a single moment. One date, one name, one flag rising over one anonymous beach. The gaps get filled with imagination. Artists add cliffs, dramatic jungles, solemn processions. The ships are placed exactly. The islanders are arranged like extras waiting for the curtain to go up. The ocean crossing becomes a simple line on a map, not a problem of dead reckoning and guesswork through shifting currents and clouds. Historical humility asks something different of us. It asks us to sit with what we can know well: wind patterns, ship types, Taíno political structures, disease dynamics, the text of the surviving journal, and also with what must remain open, the precise sandbar under his anchor, the exact words spoken on a particular morning, the looks exchanged that no one wrote down. It asks us to accept that our picture of 1492 will always be a reconstruction, never a perfect recording. But within that uncertainty, one thing stands out. What Columbus saw, even if he did not always recognize it, was a human world. Not a stage built for his arrival, but a web of relationships, knowledge and memory that had been growing for centuries before his sails appeared. Villages full of children and elders, skilled navigators in canoes, healers, storytellers, farmers who knew exactly when to plant cassava, which wines carried which fish, which reefs hid treacherous channels. His presence did not bring history to those shores. It collided with history already in motion. When we rebuild the 1492 picture, with that in mind, the story changes tone. It becomes less about discovery and more about encounter. Less a tale of empty spaces filled, and more a meeting between worlds that had evolved apart, each rich, each fragile in its own ways. As you drift towards sleep, you might let your own mental image soften and reshape. Let the neat postcard fade and replace it with something more complex, more crowded with lives. If you found this gentle walk through the past comforting or thought-provoking, you can help others find it too. Tapping like, leaving a comment, or subscribing if you haven't yet tells the algorithm that slow, careful history has a place here. And I'd love to hear from you. If you're still awake, or when you listen next time, feel free to type where you're listening from. And if you like, what time it is there. A quiet hello from your city, your village, your night shift, your bedside lamp. It's a small way of reminding ourselves that we too are dots on a larger map, scattered across the planet, connected by stories, all trying in our own ways to see the world a little more clearly before sleep.